My great pleasure to welcome everybody to this session on moving beyond compliance, looking at the links between human rights and anti-corruption. And I'm very excited we have an all-star cast joining us today for our discussion. First of all, I should introduce myself. My name's Nick Booth. I'm an advisor on rule of law, justice, human rights in UNDP's Bangkok Regional Hub. And I'm also closely involved with our project on business integrity and anti-corruption and transparency in the business sector. That's the project supported by the UK Prosperity Fund called Promoting a Fair Business Environment in ASEAN. But my team also runs the Business and Human Rights Project. And we see those two projects as absolutely indissolubly wedded to each other. The fact is that in the past, anti-corruption and human rights proceeded on kind of different tracks. They had different experts, they had different normative frameworks, different legal frameworks, and the links between them were not really brought together. But one of the exciting developments of the last few years is that finally we're beginning to understand how deeply human rights and anti-corruption are linked with one another. And we see it in many ways. So as we know, the ESG Sustainable Investment Agenda is all about the interdependence of the E, the environmental, the S, the social, and G, the governance, and the anti-corruption and business integrity is a core part of that. And even more importantly, the SDG framework, which itself is a comprehensive development framework, the governance pillar of the Sustainable Development Goals, SDG 16, recognizes the importance of fundamental rights and the importance of anti-corruption, transparency, and so on. So we have a much better recognition now of these linkages. And it's very exciting for me that we have, for the first time in our Business and Human Rights Forum, this special session really looking at how anti-corruption and human rights have to be understood together in the context of business and human rights. And I'm really delighted to be joined by an all-star panel. And so I think that the sooner we get started on the discussion, the better. So with us we have today Professor Anita Ramasastry, the Vice Chair of the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights. We have Serena Lillywhite, the Chief Executive Officer at Transparency International Australia. We have Dr. Suri Nontasut, who you all know from many years in this forum in his former role as the Thailand representative on ICHA, the Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights. But he has an extra role today as a governor on the Board of Governors of the Thailand Stock Exchange. And we have Patience Bin, the Global Ethics and Compliance Lead, Anti-Corruption and Head of Compliance for Asia Pacific from Natura & Company, giving us the voice, the corporate voice. And we're also delighted to have Professor Dr. Aisha Bidin, former Human Rights Commissioner from Suhakam in Malaysia, and now Professor of Corporate and Insolvency Law in the National University of Malaysia. So I think you all agree with me, we're very lucky to have an all-star cast. And I want to start really with Professor Anita Ramasastry. As I mentioned, Professor Anita Ramasastry is the Vice Chair of the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights. She is also a professor, she's the Ronald Hewlett Professor and Director of the Graduate Program at the Sustainable International Development at the University of Washington School of Law. And she has been very active on human rights and business corporate accountability and the founding editor, co-editor-in-chief of the Business and Human Rights Journal. And our session is particularly timely because, as you may well know, the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights is about to publish a paper on the linkages between anti-corruption and human rights at the next session of the Human Rights Council coming up this month. And so as the lead author and editor of that paper, Professor Ramasastry, can you tell us something about that research and some of the linkages that you identified and some of your key recommendations on how to strengthen the linkages between human rights and anti-corruption for governments, for businesses, and for other stakeholders? Thanks very much, Professor Ramasastry. The floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much, Nick, and thank you. And it's great to see so many friends and colleagues on this really wonderful panel. I'll be brief because we have a large panel today, but just wanted to say that the working group was really interested in making these connections because last year, actually, Serena, at the forum in Bangkok, you did a great job at one of the plenaries of trying to really make these connections and say, whenever a bribe is paid or there is engagement in terms of private sector corruption with the public sector, that there are significant human rights impacts in different areas. And so the working group decided to take up this call and say, we talk about responsible business conduct. We talk very often about anti-corruption. We talk about business and human rights, but we often don't talk about how these different areas work together, despite the fact that the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises and the UN Global Compact speak about responsible business conduct as really encompassing both of these areas. So our report to the Human Rights Council is looking at the duty of states, it is looking at the responsibility of corporations, and it's looking at how civil society can work together with both of these parties to really prevent corruption and also promote respect for human rights. And I'm really passionate about both topics. So I would say that in the area of what governments can do, we really focused on policy coherence, which I'm sure you're hearing a lot about in this forum already, but it's really about the fact that states, as they think about anti-corruption commitments and the United Nations Convention Against Corruption and their business and human rights commitments, those often reside in very different parts of government. And so the idea is, as we look at national strategies, as we look at the role of NHRIs, ministries of justice, how can we really think about this in a synthetic and coordinated manner? So a report focuses, first of all, on just how governments need to themselves align and think about areas, for example, such as export and trade promotion or procurement, where there very often are strong anti-bribery commitments, but we don't see the same commitments in terms of asking companies to respect human rights when they receive benefits from the government. So I would just say that's one of our first recommendations is where can we align and where is there room for more improvement in the state side? I would also say that we focused on policy reform. There are some key areas that especially in the anti-corruption space, there's been a lot of advocacy. Serena, I'm sure will speak about that, and Transparency International has been a leader in areas, for example, such as beneficial ownership reform and procurement reform, where we see greater benefit. And we want to emphasize as the working group that these issues will also, if we tackle them, or if governments tackle them in states, that this will also benefit human rights and benefit rights holders. An example of this is that when the working group goes on its country visits, we'll often meet with civil society or communities that have been impacted by sort of human rights abuses or issues around a major project, be it infrastructure, be it a dam, be it extraction. And when they try to figure out who is the company that is behind the issues that are impacting them, they often are stopped because they can't determine where the ownership lies. So the same issue when we're trying to figure out where money is going when it leaves a country because of corruption, we just want to say that, well, a policy reform that will solve one issue will also be beneficial to the other. So that's what we are looking at in terms of states. As far as business goes, and I'm very much looking forward to what Patience has to say today, because we have very few companies that are really aligning or thinking about how to align their compliance and anti-corruption programs and also their business and human rights programs. That most companies will have a compliance and legal and risk department, and will have a business and human rights team sitting in a CSR, sustainability, or other area. We do see some companies. I was actually speaking at an event with the EU this morning on human rights due diligence, and a company, Novartis, for example, really has spoken about a holistic approach to responsible business conduct. And I look forward to what Patience will say, because I think that's the larger challenge, is that how should and do these different issues align within a company. And the working group in its report will try to convince you that it is better to go beyond integrity and to have this holistic approach to all of these different impacts in terms of the company's overall strategy. So I look forward to hearing from the other panelists today.
Thanks very much, Anita. That got us off to a great start. And I'd now like to pass to Dr. Suri. And as I say, Dr. Suri is very well known to all of us in this community for many years because of his sterling work when he was Thailand representative to the Intergovernmental Commission of Human Rights. And during that time, he was a champion for many issues, including disability rights, but also business and human rights. And he really did an extraordinary amount to raise the awareness of business and human rights around the whole of ASEAN. And at the same time, he was a key advisor to the Ministry of Justice in Thailand and really helped Thailand, lead the field by being the first country in our region to adopt a national and a very, very good, if I may say, an excellent national action plan on business and human rights. So we're incredibly grateful to Dr. Suri for all his work there. And it's very exciting to us that he's now joined the Thai Stock Exchange as on the board of governors. And that's very exciting for me in my capacity working on our Fair Business Environment in ASEAN project, because one of our key platforms is to work with stock exchanges in Thailand and in other ASEAN countries to really help them demand more of listed companies in addressing all of the three letters of ESG, the environmental, yes, the social, including the human rights, but also the governance and understanding that without good governance, and in particular, without integrating anti-corruption across their whole business, there's no way that they will actually achieve the environmental and social impacts for the reasons that Professor Anita was just saying. So, Dr. Suri, can you tell us about the role that the Thai Stock Exchanges is playing in ensuring that Thai-listed companies are integrating human rights and anti-corruption into their operations, just as Professor Anita was talking about, and in so doing, playing their role to fulfill the National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights? And what challenges do you see, and what are your recommendations on how to solve those challenges? Over to you, Dr. Suri.
Good afternoon from Bangkok, and I would like to thank the organizers for the invitation to join this timely and interesting global forum. I'm joining the forum as a governor of the Stock Exchange of Thailand, but the views and the perspectives that are going to be presented are entirely my own. I like to begin by saying that the Thai Stock Exchange is a key stakeholder in the ecosystem that is called the capital market. There are a number of players in this system, and its health, growth, and sustainability are interconnected with those of its members. It should also be pointed out that the stock exchange itself is a platform that is regulated by the Securities and Exchange Commission, the capital market regulator. When we focus on the stock exchange, which is essentially a trading platform, there are two major roles that it has played in regard to the integration of human rights and anti-corruption in the operation of the 555 companies that are listed currently. The first role is knowledge platform on environment, social, and governance, or the ESG issues. Anti-corruption is an integral and important part of the G, or governance, in the ESG paradigm. And the SET has been recognized nationally and regionally as a leading ESG knowledge hub. The SET provides training and knowledge sharing on ESG to listed companies, as well as those seeking listing approval. More pertinently, I would say, on the governance issue, the SET has introduced standard setting in the form of a CG code that is aligned with international standards, such as the OECD Principles of Corporate Governance. The second role pertains to its products. In 2015, the SET launched the Thailand Sustainability Investment List, which represents listed companies that have integrated and demonstrated recognized risk management, including anti-corruption measures and supply chain management, as well as ESG policies and practices. In 2018, the SET introduced the Thailand Sustainability Index, which tracks and reflects performance and value of ESG listed companies. Currently, out of 555 listed companies, 63 are included in this thematic index, which is reviewed every 6 months. It is also important to note the initiatives of two other leading players in this capital market ecosystem. The Securities and Exchange Commission announced a clear policy earlier this year that from the year 2022, all companies that request approval for initial public offering, IPO, must include in their public disclosure data set information pertaining to respect for human rights, in line with the guiding principles on business and human rights and the Thai National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights, which was adopted in October 2019. Listed companies are also mandated to do the same starting from next year. This is a major development, and kudos to the SEC. Equally noteworthy is the launch of the collaborative engagement by the Government Pension Fund, the second largest institutional investor in the country, of which I'm also a board member, in August last year. This collaborative engagement is a signed memorandum reflecting joint commitment of 32 fund managers whose combined asset under management accounts to more than 80% of the total national pool, that they would integrate ESG in their investment and divestment decision and adopt a negative list of companies that violate ESG's principles. Needless to say, Nick, that the most critical challenge is the extent to which companies, both listed and non-listed, have incorporated anti-corruption policies and measures in their operation. We have seen some early promising signs. Many companies have now put a no-gift policy during major festivals and holidays, during which it had been traditional to give presents to ranking officers. And I do hope that this will become one of the new normals in the post-pandemic time. I would end my intervention now, because I do have elaboration to be made in a second half of my intervention. Nick, thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Dr. Suri. And now I'd like to pass to Serena Lillywhite. And as I mentioned earlier, she is the Chief Executive Officer for Transparency International Australia. So of course, as you know, TI plays an extraordinarily important role as a watchdog and technical support on anti-corruption around the world. And she's been working for years to strengthen the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises on corporate accountability mechanisms and performance standards. And she's also no stranger to our region. She's lived and worked in both China and Cambodia. So from the perspective of civil society, Serena, it would be great to hear from you. As an anti-corruption advocate, how does civil society view the integration between human rights and corruption in business? And what for you are the most important entry points for improving integration between those two perspectives? I'd love to pass the floor over to you now. Thanks, Serena.
Thank you very much, Nick, and my thanks to the UN for the invitation to be here again, although in somewhat different circumstances to last year. And thank you also, Anita, for acknowledging the contribution I made last year, and I'm really excited to see the forthcoming guide from the UN Working Group on Corruption and Human Rights. So congratulations for that work. I think that the point that a couple of key points I'd like to make is, I mean, the nexus between human rights and corruption is really clear in our mind. Countries that are corruption prone are also often characterized by conflict and by human rights violations. And many serious human rights violations that do involve business often have corruption as an underlying factor. And for governments, that can also then mean that decisions are not being made in the public interest, and issues such as undue influence by special interest groups and conflicts of interest actually become the driver of investment and shape policy and practice. And so when that occurs, it means that communities and citizens are often denied their rights, such as access to education, such as access to health. And that happens when money that's intended for these essential services is siphoned off by the powerful elite, you know, whether that is government or whether indeed it's business. And corruption and its impunity, and indeed the failure of states and businesses to protect and respect human rights, really undermines the functioning and the legitimacy of states, institutions, state processes. It weakens the rule of law, as we know, which then in turn further exacerbates corruption and human rights violations. So you get this vicious cycle occurring. And just picking up on a point that Anita made with regards to procurement, when corruption leads governments to, for example, contract with unqualified companies or individuals through their procurement processes, that then can have really serious implications, particularly related to things like infrastructure, for example, where you see poor quality of delivery and poor quality of goods and services. And I think that's a particular risk that we're facing at the moment in this COVID era that we're in. And we also know, Nick, that it's marginalised and discriminated groups and individuals who suffer disproportionately from corruption and human rights violations. That means those people living in poverty, Indigenous peoples, workers, and of course, women. And that's because corruption, like human rights abuse, is not gender neutral. It's women who are disproportionately affected, and in the worst case scenarios, that involves what at TI we call sextortion, the paying of bribes with sexual favours, and also, of course, trafficking. And the other, I guess, lens that we look at this nexus between corruption and human rights is through the really damaging impact that it has on democracy, the undermining of democracy. It has a chilling effect on press freedom. And around the world, we're seeing an increasing number of attacks on investigative journalists who are seeking to shine a spotlight and expose corruption and human rights violations. We're seeing environmental defenders and human rights defenders increasingly under attack as they try and shine a spotlight on the links between corruption, human rights and environmental degradation. And it's often in these large-scale land deals, including land grabs, whether it's potentially in the extractive sector, in the hydro sector, in infrastructure or large-scale agribusiness, that we often have this nexus between corruption and human rights violations really highlighted, and particularly with regards to when it leads to a loss of livelihoods and conflict. So just to give you an example, TI Australia is leading a global program called Accountable Mining. And we're implementing this with our colleagues across 20 countries. And it's looking particularly at the corruption risks in right at the beginning of the mining life cycle, when licenses and permits are awarded, when approvals are granted. And this is a particularly high risk phase for both corruption, where it can get a foothold, but also where decisions are made that impact on the rights of communities. And through this program, we've identified one particular area where this nexus is really evident, and that relates to community consultation. And that's because we know that corruption can really prevent men and women from participating in meaningful community consultations. And that's particularly apparent when and if deals are done behind closed doors, when approvals are granted that are not in the public interest. And when this happens, it means that projects such as mining projects can proceed without true consideration of community rights and interests. And as a result, then men and women face significant threats to their human rights, to access to land, to health and well-being, and also customary traditions. So just in the final moments I have, in terms of some entry points for improving this integration, I do think that we need to strengthen the due diligence lens, and congratulations to the OECD Working Group on Responsible Business Conduct and the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights for progressing that work. But the challenge now is to ensure this due diligence work is not siloed, as we've heard. I think the one area that we can really strengthen these linkages is with regards to beneficial ownership as a key part of ideally mandated due diligence, to really understand who are the ultimate beneficiaries. I also think there's scope to improve integration by having a better understanding of sector-specific corruption risks as a way of understanding or improving our understanding of what those corruption and human rights risks are. And we need to do more with regards to ensuring that applies and is useful and practical for small to medium-sized enterprises. So I think really the key is transparency, accountability, and gender inclusive participation at the heart of trying to improve this understanding of the integration between corruption and human rights. And that's going to mean much more meaningful participation in project decision making as a way of integrating that. And also it's going to mean I think strengthening and protecting whistleblower protection as part of tackling both corruption and human rights risks. And that's something that can apply to both governments and also to states. So I think for me, the key would be to ensure transparent, meaningful, gender inclusive stakeholder engagement as a key component of trying to as an entry point to better understanding the links between corruption and human rights.
Thanks very much, Serena. So now we've had the perspective from regulators, from experts, from civil society, and it's time to hear the corporate perspective. So delighted to welcome to our panel Patience Bin, the Global Ethics and Compliance Lead on Anti-Corruption and Head of Compliance for Asia Pacific of Natura & Co., which includes many famous brands that you all know, like Avon, Natura, The Body Shop, and Aesop. And like me, she started out her life as a lawyer in big American firms. Patience, you've heard really from all the speakers a lot about this, the importance of integrating, and Anita told us that the problem that traditionally in corporations, the human rights work came from a background of CSR, so it tends to be in that part. The anti-corruption comes from the kind of compliance and legal risk, so that we see this kind of siloed approach where these linkages are not really often enough brought together and integrated in the way that companies address these. And this is a huge concern for us in our Fair Business and Environment in ASEAN project. One of our main concerns is to try and help companies really understand the linkages and also bring them together as an integrated perspective in the way that they look at their impact on their business operations. So it's really great for us to hear from you how you've been doing that in your company. So please, Patience, tell us some of the secrets and the key advice you'd give to other corporates on how to deal with this.
Thanks, Nick. So I have been practicing FCPA and anti-corruption for the past decade. So before I joined my current company, I was actually in private practice in Hong Kong and Washington, DC as a white-collar criminal defense attorney, so mainly focusing on anti-corruption and FCPA. So I think over the past decade, the experience I have been seeing is actually the compliance program of companies actually evolve quite a lot. I mean, for the company that are really very focusing on compliance, like financial industry, pharmaceutical industry, or any company that were used to be subject to any DOJ and SEC investigations, I mean, they do have, a pretty comprehensive compliance program, which includes, and obviously, due diligence. And once they include a due diligence program, they will try to leverage the anti-corruption due diligence program to include more areas like anti-money laundering, sanctions, fraud, conflict of interest, and human rights as well. So how I have been seeing company has been doing is in their due diligence questionnaire for their third parties or vendors, franchisees, distributors, or agents to fill in, they actually would also include some aspect for human rights as well. So how they do that would be, for example, for due diligence questionnaire for party to fill in, normally they would need to provide names of their majority shareholders, key management, and the board of directors. So normally, for pretty much standard due diligence, they would put those names for background checks. And those as long as you engage a global vendor, they normally will run on the checks on publicly available criminal, civil information, any environmental issue, tax issues, watch list, sanction list. So basically, if there is a human rights issues, most likely it's going to be hit. So at that time, when you receive the due diligence reports on the background searches, the company, sometimes the compliance council, sometimes it's the outsourced vendor that conducts the due diligence, or sometimes it's some special committee. They will make a decision on, okay, how do we deal with this tax issue, or how do we deal with this human rights violation issue, this child labor issue. So that's one way the company covers it, human rights on top of anti-corruption. And in addition to that, another way to do that is some companies do include some standard questions in their anti-corruption due diligence / compliance due diligence questionnaire. They will ask whether you have been subject to any investigation or enforcement actions that are related to like fraud or sanctions or like moral turpitude or human rights. So that is an angle to conveniently to include more areas into the due diligence questionnaire to cover more areas that are related to ethics and compliance as well. So on top of those, many companies that I saw and also have their supplier code of conduct, which they require all suppliers to comply with. And in the supplier code of conduct, I mean, they will also address issue about, okay, forbidding the child labor or forced labor. They will require the supplier to provide their workers with reasonable work hours, wage benefits, and also ensure the health and safety of their workers. And also for companies like fast-moving consumer goods, pharmaceuticals, or companies in the food industries, they will also require the supplier to have like responsible sourcing, which require their supplier to source from places which have the same fundamental support for like human rights or labor or ethics or health and safety. So by combining all this together, you would be, I think as more companies start to have more understanding of the importance of like anti-corruption, I mean, and then they started to invest more money into the compliance program. When you add on top of the sanctions and human rights, it's actually a very cost-effective thing. So that will actually something that we recommend like all the companies that are interested in implementing an anti-corruption program to also do as well, because it's really, it will be pretty much effective and also would not add a lot of like compliance cost to the company.
Thanks very much, Patience. And so the last panelist in our lineup for today, last but certainly not least, is Professor Dr. Aisha Bidin, who is Professor of Corporate and Insolvency Law at the Faculty of Law at the National University of Malaysia. And again, well known to many of us and an old friend of many of us from her former role as one of the commissioners in Suhakam, the National Human Rights Institute of Malaysia. So Professor Aisha, it's great to welcome you back. And I'm going to start by asking you a question very much related to your current role, because I'm delighted to announce that hot off the press, so to speak, the Malaysian legislature has recently, well, actually the government has recently brought into force the Section 17A of the Malaysian Anti-Corruption Commissions Act that introduces expanded corporate liability for corruption. So this new corporate liability and anti-bribery provision, terrifically important in expanding the scope in Malaysia. So can you perhaps comment on that a little bit? And I know it's too early to be having a crystal ball on forecasting, but can you tell us something about why that law is important and what entry points you're expecting it will provide in Malaysia, including entry points for addressing human rights?
Okay, thank you very much, Nick. And again, of course, thank you for inviting me to participate in this very important session. I come here, perhaps, as you said, as a former commissioner who is working with the relevant ministry on National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights. And of course, one of the aspects on good governance, the G aspect, is the one that we realize is relevant in this. Now, perhaps a little bit of a brief background as regards to the pre-amendment, the position before the amendment took place. Now, as far as corruption committed by businesses in Malaysia, we do not have a specific legislation for that. Now, for companies in Malaysia, they are governed by the Companies Act 2016, and for public and listed companies, there are other legislation, Capital Market Services Act, and so forth. So the general duty on directors is also more or less the same as the position in UK, that is to act in the best interest of the company as a whole. But of course, for corruption, that requires specific technical elements. So pre-Section 17A of the MACC, there were problems in actually bringing into justice for businesses because of the high onus, the onus of proof for the prosecution in that sense, because to establish the criminal intent. And this is actually very true for offenses that they want to prosecute for the companies, because to establish the directing mind and will of the company. So I think there was a problem in relation to that. Yeah? Now, the law was passed in May 2018, and it came to force just last week. So there was a duration of 2 years. There was issues. Why was there a 2 years timeline given to enforce the law? Now, part of the reason was to allow for business entities and companies to facilitate and take the time to improve their structure and system, to accommodate what you call mechanism, to enhance the system. So that was also part of the reason. So I think for the past 2 years, there seems to be quite a number of program awareness by MSCC, educational program, even by the Prime Minister Department to various sectors. Now, come into the picture, Section 17A of MSCC. Now, what does it do? Now, very interesting enough is that the new Section 17A not only establishes a new statutory corporate liability of offense of corruption for the term now is commercial organization under Malaysian law, but it also deems any director, controller, officer, partner, or manager of a commercial organization to be personally liable for the same offense if the commercial organization is found liable, unless, of course, if they can provide a defense, a statutory defense, which is unless the relevant individual can prove that the offense was committed without his or her consent, and that he or she has exercised the requisite due diligence to prevent the commission of the offense. So we can see clearly in terms of the scope, the contents of the liability. Now, another interesting implication of this particular section is in terms of who is potentially liable for the particular offense. Now, Section 17A, subsection 6 of the Act also stipulates that persons considered to be associated with a commercial organization includes directors, partners, and employees of the commercial organization, as well as any person who perform services for or on behalf of the commercial organization. Now, this is very interesting because not only the company can be liable for bribery by its directors or partners, but also its employees, irregardless of the status or function. So, which means that it could also be liable for bribery by agents, distributors, and potentially joint venture partners. Now, this is very important if you link that to the second pillar when it comes to the duty of corporation to respect. And we are talking about policy commitment. We are talking about the process of due diligence. We are talking about the supply chain. I think that's the target. Now, we realize that it is extended to parties which are third parties, which deals with the company. Now, in addition, further, I think as far as the implication is that the what you call commercial organization also include not only companies, but also include partnership, other partnerships. And of course, in Malaysia, there are LLPs, limited liability partnership, conventional partnership, in which they are governed by a separate legislation. And that legislation actually is silent on corruption. So everything now comes under Section 17A, which I think lists out in terms of the parameters and the scope. Another aspect, I think it's also another major implication is in terms of the heavy penalty, right? Section 17A2 talks about the penalty for the offense, which I think is actually not less than 10 times of the value of the gratification in question, or about 1 million ringgit, whichever is higher, or imprisonment of not more than 20 years or both. Now, the position before that actually is only a fine not less than 5 times the value of the gratification in question, or 10,000 Malaysian ringgit. So I think in that sense, we can see that they are very, very serious in terms of enforcing, in terms of enforcing the law, which actually came to force last week. So it is still a little bit early, as you said, but I have to say, based on the programs, awareness programs and the consultation that have gone through, it is actually welcome very much in terms of this new law, because it marks certainly a new agenda, not only to facilitate the gaps in the law itself, but also in a way promoting business and human rights and transparency in corporate reporting. I was also personally involved in a particular research with the Malaysian Institute of Corporate Governance back in 2017, in which this was a study of 100 top listed companies in Malaysia. And 3 aspects that we actually focus on. One is in terms of disclosure or transparency reporting within the concept of anti-corruption programs. Number 2 is transparency organization. And number 3 is relating to sustainability and human rights. So I focus very much on the sustainability issues. But what did surprise us when we brought forward the outcome of the research to the minister at that time in charge, the Prime Minister Department in charge of Human Rights and Integrity, is for reporting on anti-corruption programs, the average score is 3 upon 10. Now, out of 13 companies, they had a total score of 0 in this entire dimension. And from the 11 out of the 13 questions, more than 50 companies scored 0. So there were 13 questions which deals with areas on relating to anti-corruption programs, which covers like commitment to anti-corruption, extending to a supply chain, commitment relating to compliance of the law, leadership support, programs applied to suppliers, and so forth. So that was in 2017, in which irrespective of structure and ownership, of those companies that are selected, and only 100, we realized that compliance and reporting on corruption was weak. So that was concerned back at that time. So certainly, I think at that point, this particular amendment is something very much welcome. Of course, it is yet to be seen in terms of the implication and the efficacy of the program. And I think your second part of your question was that you asked what is the linkages between business and human rights. Certainly, as I mentioned just now, in terms of the transparency reporting, so the second pillar, we do realize, as a former commissioner, I do realize when we consult with the industry selected companies, we do realize some of them do have certain programs and mechanisms in which they have integrated in their system regarding the commitment on anti-corruption. But that's not to say for the general opinion. So perhaps at this point of time, maybe I would just like to end there in terms of the implication of Section 17A of the MECC Act 2009. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Professor Aisha. And congratulations to Malaysia on this very important legislative step forward. I hope that sends a very positive signal and message to some other Asian countries that haven't yet quite got as far as Malaysia. And I think your address also gives us a real wake-up call for companies in Malaysia, companies that do business in Malaysia, especially given the results of the research that you referred to, that a lot of them will really need to get their house in order. And as you've said, this act and the new corporate liability provisions really also open up the whole question of their partnerships and the need for stronger due diligence and stronger adherence to their obligation to respect human rights. So I think this is a very important and timely thing for everybody working in Malaysia, and it's a very important positive signal for all the other ASEAN countries that we work in to follow the very good lead from Malaysia. I want to congratulate and thank all of the panelists, not only for the richness of their intervention, their opening interventions, but also for the fact they came very well within time. The good news is it means we're going to have time for lots of questions. So for all of you who haven't, I see we have lots of great questions coming in. Please post your questions on the Q&A section, not on the chat if you possibly can. That way everyone will be able to see your good questions. They'll be able to upvote the questions they like the most, so that rather than having to ask the same question, they can give a thumbs up and make it more likely that question will be asked. And I'm just going to take advantage of their great timing to ask a little short follow-up questions to each of the panelists before we start taking your questions. And I'm going to mix up the order a little bit. I'm going to ask my follow-up question first to Serena. So Serena, you gave us a fantastic overview of the key, the most practical areas of greatest risk in terms of the way that human rights and anti-corruption need to work together. And so if I could ask you for your follow-up, if you had one key recommendation you would be making from the civil society perspective to governments, and one key recommendation to businesses, the thing you'd most like to see businesses do, you'd most like to see governments do to strengthen the integration of these elements, what would your top 2 recommendations be?
Thanks for that. That's a toughie. I guess and it probably applies to both business and government, but let's just, I'll stick to business to begin with. I'd certainly like to see perhaps a shift in our due diligence thinking from a risk to business to actually a risk to people. So we're really, both companies and businesses are really getting a sense that due diligence needs to be done not only to assess the risks to business, but really needs to be very outward looking with a strong driver of what are the potential impacts on communities. And secondly, and I guess this actually does apply to both business and government as well, is the need for really gender inclusive, meaningful consultation and engagement with communities who are directly impacted by investment decisions and business practices, because I think that is where we're going to see a much better understanding of the impact of corruption, the impact of human rights on people's daily lives. And I think that if both government and industry have a better understanding of just what it looks like in terms of people's livelihoods, in terms of their children being able to access education, health, then that's really going to be an important step forward in really integrating how we address both corruption and human rights risks.
Thanks very much. And my next follow-up question is to Dr. Suri. And Dr. Suri, so you gave us a very powerful demonstration of how not only the government, but also the regulatory authorities like the Stock Exchange and the Securities and Exchange Commission in Thailand have been taking very proactive and concrete steps to integrate anti-corruption and human rights. And I'm now going to ask you this question. You know that in this time of the pandemic, there's a lot of talk about building back better and new opportunities. And I wonder if you have had time to reflect on some of the possible challenges and opportunities that governments and regulatory bodies may face or be able to leverage in integrating human rights and anti-corruption agendas as we move out of the pandemic into the post-pandemic world.
Thank you, Nick. I can't say thank enough for Serena for providing the clear nexus between human rights and corruption, and also kudos to the Malaysian government for introducing the Section 17A. And I'm really looking forward to seeing the report coming from Anita and her colleagues. Let me point out right away that in Thailand and generally in other countries in this region, we already have integrated both human rights and anti-corruption policies in various agendas through a multitude of institutions and mechanisms, and significant progress has been made. But of course, there are a few notable challenges that are now exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. I want to point out 3 challenges. Number 1, And this is pre-existing prior to COVID-19, and the Malaysian government seemed to have tackled that. There have been misconceptions, and two misconceptions really. Misconception that corruption and human rights are mutually exclusive, and corporate fraud and bribery that do not involve public officials is a private matter. It is clear from various standards that corruption is a human rights violation. I look at this morning, there are 187 countries that have ratified the UN Convention on Anti-Corruption, which also seeks to prevent corruption among businesses. Anti-corruption is also a key principle of the UN Global Compact Network that has more than 10,000 members all over in the world. And we will be looking closely at what the Malaysian government has done in introducing that Section 17A, prohibiting and preventing corruption in businesses. My number two challenge that I think is upcoming is the realignment and reprioritization of national agendas as a result of the pandemic. Unlike any other natural disasters and crises in recent history, in Thailand, we had a major flood in 2011 that caused nationwide disruption. This COVID-19 crisis has affected every country around the world. And in response to the crisis, many countries have come up with public finance schemes to alleviate the impact on the economy and affected sectors. I think we are still in the eye of the storm, but we already know that at least 20% of value of companies has been decreased. What we can now be sure of is that post-COVID-19, we will see significant depletion and limit of resources in both public and private sectors. And COVID-19 itself has rendered necessary the rethink of public and private strategies on priorities and planning to respond to the disruption of many kinds to come. The realignment of priorities and strategies that will take place will mean two things for human rights and anti-corruption, in my view. Number one, we need to make sure that the money that states are putting in the system to sustain and hopefully revive the economy is allocated and used efficiently and prudently. So anti-corruption policies and measures, more than ever, will be a fundamental component of every stimulus program. It will help us to be sure that the money, which is already limited, it will spend. Number two, it is very likely, but I hope it won't happen, that many human rights and agendas will be sidestepped in view of a more pressing concerns such as health and economic policies. In the case of Thailand, and Anita pointed out in the beginning that the silo caused the division between anti-corruption and human rights. But I think that such division may help to put on a prominent lens human rights and anti-corruption still, because we are fortunate that we have announced and put in place clear agenda on business and human rights. We put out as priorities in Thailand 4 areas in the NAP, namely labor, environment, human rights defenders, and investment. But we must be mindful that there are other cross-cutting issues, including poverty, gender, and anti-corruption that must also be addressed. The third challenge, and I think this applies to everyone, is inequality, which is rising. We see that during the pandemic, we planned for, to sustain the economy, to help certain marginalized sectors, but we forgot to include many others. For example, and this comes as an afterthought, the elderly, migrant workers, people with disabilities. Of course, we need to be more inclusive, like Serena pointed out, after COVID-19. And I think the success of our society will depend on how successful we help and safeguard these vulnerable groups. These are the 3 challenges that I see coming up. What can we do? Again, 3 issues. And I just want to echo the first line of thought with Serena. We need to have robust transparency requirement. And I think we need to learn. We can learn from Malaysia what they have done. Number 2 is effective grievance mechanism. This will help to ensure that businesses, when they plan, when they execute, and government, when they conduct large procurement project, there is an effective grievance mechanism. And I'm heartened that we put in place, but we need to make sure that it is effective. The protection of human rights defenders, anti-SLAPP law must be put in place so that whenever a grievance is made, no threat is put to silence, the victims. Thirdly, policy innovation. And I would look forward to see procurement be featured prominently in the report of both TI and the working group. But let me point out on procurement that there have been discussions that government, at least in the Thai perspective, whether we should require that in large procurement projects, we should only allow those who have been certified with the international standard. There is a new one called ISO 37001. But we found out that this may be too onerous for companies. We then innovated to say that, okay, in large procurement projects, at least we should allow CSO to participate and observe during the bidding process. This certainly will help. But what is most viable of all, and I think this will apply to business particularly, is the two strands of the UNGP, supply chain management and due diligence. And we are helped by the likes of OECD and the working group in introducing the new manual on due diligence. They should use that to the maximum to ensure that they engage with the right people, they conduct the right procedure on the bidding process. Thank you, Nick.
Thanks very much, Dr. Sri, and thanks for reminding us that even as you might think that the risk of anti-corruption and human rights going further down the agenda in governments as they come out of the pandemic may be greater, actually it's the importance has also never been greater, as you say, both to conserve precious resources from the spoilage of anti-corruption, and because it's actually those groups who are worst off, most marginalized, whose human rights are most at risk, that have been most affected by COVID. And thanks also for raising the point of procurement, which is a great tool for governments not only to strengthen their anti-corruption work, but also to be able to incentivize compliance with human rights from the companies that want to bid for government contracts. So that's a really important, and thank you for being the first person to remind us of the important linkage with procurement. I'd now like to ask a similar question to patients. So patients, we know, of course, that many businesses have been under tremendous strain in COVID. And I wonder what you see both in your company and in other companies. Have there been any challenges in keeping the importance of anti-corruption and human rights in the company even during difficult times? And similarly, are there also entry points? I've seen research showing that the companies that have done best on ESG are also the companies that have actually proved most resilient in the pandemic. So are there also opportunities for the agenda around anti-corruption and human rights in companies that may actually, we may be able to leverage coming out of the pandemic?
Well, thank you for your question, Nick. First of all, our company still remain really committed to ethics and compliance, regardless whether there is a pandemic or not. And in addition to that, recently the U.S. Department of Justice, at the beginning of the month, did issue a new guidance document, to update the 2017 evaluation of compliance program. Document basically says that emphasize that the program needs to be adequately resourced and empowered to function efficiently. So it is a top agenda for any U.S. listed companies or any U.S. company in the world. Regarding my company in particular, the company remains very committed to ethics and compliance. Like for example, within the Avon brand, normally, we do require anti-corruption review for any charitable contribution. And in this pandemic, we prioritize the review because we wanted to help the people who really need resource in this pandemic. So we do prioritize the anti-corruption review for charitable contributions. For example, as you may know, the domestic violence rate on women actually significant against women actually significantly increased during COVID-19. Avon has been very committed to the prevention of domestic violence, so we do some charitable contribution on that. And as part of the compliance anti-corruption review, we expedite those review because this is a very important cause for us. In addition to that, within the Avon brand, we also encourage the speak up. We have always been having a speak up policy, but this time of the year, we especially emphasize that because we wanted the associates to feel comfortable to speak up if they feel discriminated because of their national origin or because they have their health problems. So that's something we did that was new, I mean, because of the pandemic. Another thing that we have done is, so at the beginning of the year, before COVID-19, we do have our regular training, compliance training plan and compliance monitoring plans. So right now, because of the travel restriction, we did evolve them to remote monitoring and remote training using Teams. It's still very effective because we can still have face-to-face interactions with people. So this is what we have been doing, trying to accommodate the situation that we can't have face-to-face interaction, but at the same time, keep our commitment to compliance.
Thanks very much indeed. And last, oh no, not even last, actually. Professor Aisha, can I come back to you? Can I now ask you to think back to your experience as a former commissioner with SUACOM? How did SUACOM and how do you recommend that human rights institutions should integrate anti-corruption into their mandate on the promotion and protection of human rights? What are your top tips?
Okay, thank you, Nick. During my term as a commissioner in charge of business and human rights, I do realize that the commission at that time did not actually focus corruption as one of the core area, because there were other pressing critical areas that we have to work on, like the plight of migrant workers, the indigenous group. And in fact, there's so many complaints and cases. Trafficking was a very big issue, and we were dealing with quite a number of complaints and national inquiry, public inquiry that we have to go to. So it's only in the area of business and human rights that we realize there's a very strategic platform that we can promote and do consultation with the relevant parties. Now, as far as the public sector or corruption in the public sector, when we relate that with the first pillar, it is observed that, as far as Malaysia is concerned, I think the plan is pitch perfect. As far as what is in law is perfect, because we start with the National Integrity Plan in 2004, and then there are the Government Transformation Program for the GLC, a Government Link Corporation in 2010 and 2012. And then with the previous government, they then launched the National Anti-Corruption Plan 2019 to 2023. That was by the former government. And if you look at the statement of vision, it's sort of voiced out very strongly in terms of the government to combat corruption, linking it with all the indicators, SDG 16 and so forth. So we take it from there during our consultation process to bring out this issue and link that to the duty of or responsibility of the duty of, for the role of the government for the state to protect, which includes relating to procurement and so forth. So that is also backed up by all the national plan. But the concern, of course, now is then how do you then pick it up, relating to with this coming of the new law under Section 17E. Now, what perhaps maybe are the follow-ups? So we have started, let's say, last time in 2015, the Commission has come up with a strategic framework for the National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights, in which we have come up with 17 recommendations for companies to work with the various stakeholders that sort of incorporate all the three pillars. Among them, of course, include issues relating to good governance, whistleblowing, anti-corruption. So that's one which I do hope that coming up, we would like to integrate that into the National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights, in which the ministry involved is the Ministry of Law. The next aspect, which is actually very important with the coming into force of the new law, is how then the business entities or commercial organization then incorporate adequate procedures, because adequate procedures is considered as one of the defense. And as early as December 2018, the Prime Minister Department has issued a set of guidelines in relation to assist certain anti-bribery measures, right, that can be adopted by companies. So this is actually as a response to that defense provided by the Act. Now, among this, of course, this is actually based, if I'm not mistaken, based on Section 9(1) of the UK Bribery Act 2010, right? So in fact, the law itself, Section 78, was very much modeled to the UK Bribery Act. So what I think now the Commission will look forward to is the good practices that they can integrate into the system for the companies. For instance, the due diligence provisions, the adequate procedures, which is actually translated or can be equated with the guidelines for the guidelines by the Prime Minister Department, include provisions relating to promote whistleblowing, risk management, implementing policy, internal controls, governance, and so forth, right? So this again are in that particular guidelines, and if it's adopted, it can also establish the fact that companies has taken adequate measures, and this can be provided as a defense for that. So the later part relating to adequate procedure is something that I do hope that the Commission will actually continue to work, right? Because this is something that we have been doing in the consultation back since 2018. So I think that's for now, Nick. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much indeed. And now back to Professor Ramasastry. And by the way, I should tell everybody, and she told us about her passion for this issue. And the testament to that is that she's joining us from Seattle, where it's now 12:36 a.m. It's almost 1 o'clock in the morning. And she was up already to join an EU panel about due diligence at 4 o'clock this morning. So she is really putting in those famous long hours that people are telling us about in COVID times. So Professor Ramasastry, you know, we have a very strong trend coming up now about mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence. Is it time to start bringing corruption due diligence into that conversation?
That's a really interesting question, Nick, and happy to think about it in different ways. I think actually push for mandatory human rights due diligence, which we're seeing now. France led the way. We have other laws that may take place or be coming out in Europe. And then we have the European Commission announcing that they are going to look into binding regulation or directive on the topic. So there's really momentum here. And the question that some are asking is, well, what about corruption? But I want to back up and say that what's already happening and what you've heard about from patients, and you'll hear from other company representatives, is that because there are civil and criminal sanctions for companies that engage in bribery, either themselves directly or through their agents or representatives, that you already have robust programs and due diligence of some sort because of the sanction and the fear of liability. So what we're hoping for, of course, is that on the human rights side, that we move to have stronger procedures for human rights due diligence and impact assessments, and that there will be a new trend. So that's the first point I have, which is that the working group has discovered that absent that mandatory requirement or absent sanctions, that companies have not moved as quickly as we would like to see integration of the UN guiding principles into the way in which they do business and think about risks to the people where they operate. That's my first point. The second point, though, is that in both areas, in the area of corruption and in the area of human rights, the whole concept of due diligence is about asking companies to identify and then prevent and mitigate the harms and the risks that are going to happen by virtue of their engaging in these harmful activities, whether it's corruption or whether it's a human rights related impact. On the corruption side, we hope that by thinking more about human rights, as Serena and others have mentioned, that thinking about corruption in a much broader way than just economic harm or competition between rivals and gaining an advantage, that there will be an even stronger commitment to really preventing corruption by companies. That's one goal. And the second is that we hope in both areas that by thinking about this idea of due diligence, that there'll be a greater focus on access to remedy. The UN Working Group's report not only talks about the desire for mandatory human rights due diligence, borrowing a bit from the corruption compliance arena, but also says that we must have access to effective remedy as part of the system. It's not enough to ask companies to engage in processes. Aisha mentions, for example, safe harbors or defenses of adequate procedures. You can imagine them in both fields, in both human rights and in corruption. But the key really is if there's a failure to engage properly, or if there is a cause of harm, there should be adequate remedy provided as part of any regime. And this is something the working group is quite clear on. That same issue still remains in corruption. We do sanction companies if they are found to be engaged in corruption, but the larger issue is that when the harms tend to be collective, and Serena mentioned those, in infrastructure projects, if a bribe is paid and education is not delivered, what happens to the people whose rights have been deprived and denied? And access to remedy when you have collective victims still remains a very big challenge. So I'd say that we really do need to improve our processes on both sides. Maybe that's by calling corruption or a call for more due diligence or enhanced due diligence in both places. But I would say that as a starting point, we need binding human rights due diligence now.
Thank you very much. And I'm actually going to start asking all of the panel some of the best and most popular questions that the audience have come up with. So actually, I have a related question, and actually it's been asked to everyone in the panel, but I'm going to ask Professor Anita to deal with it first. And the question is, let me just look it up here. So the questioner says, states seem to show more political will for enacting hard law measures to combat bribery, but they're still hesitating to enact mandatory human rights due diligence on a wide scale. And they prefer reporting and transparency regulation with weak enforcement mechanisms. And they give the example of the UK that says the UK has a great progressive bribery act. So why is it so slow in moving towards mandatory human rights due diligence legislation? Anita, any thoughts on that?
I've actually written about this as an academic, and I think one of the issues is that we have to step back. We have the UN Convention Against Corruption, and Dr. Suri mentioned, of course, the number of states that have signed on to that particular treaty is amazing, but it took a long time to get there. So if we go back to the 1970s, we had the US Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which came out of a major political scandal in the United States called Watergate. And from there, we had a slow journey from the US to the OECD, which has an anti-bribery convention dealing with foreign bribery, and from there to UNCAC in 2005. So if we look at that trajectory, it took quite a long time. And what it really was first one country moved, and then it used its influence to bring companies and other states on board through another regional convention. And once some companies were subject to regulation, they started to become champions and to argue for leveling the playing field. So it's one of those things where you need to see a trajectory. So if we compare the area of business and human rights, depending on how you look at it, you can say this is taking way too long. But part of this is about just thinking about a train picking up momentum and speed. So now that we have France moving, and now that we have the EU making a commitment, you'll suddenly have companies subject to that regulation. And once they are subject to it, then they are going to move and ask for that same type of commitment through processes like the G20, through processes like APEC. I mean, that you'll see that this will potentially blossom. I'd say that, but I'd also say, of course, the world has changed. Will there be that same appetite for multilateralism that we had around the UN Convention Against Corruption? It's our job, if we believe in this, to move for it. But I would say that part of this is just about watching the progression.
Thank you very much. Serena, would you like to comment on that question? And I have a special question just for you, which is, can you give us an example of a really good model of gender inclusive consultation you were giving as your key recommendation? Is there a great model of transparent, meaningful, gender inclusive stakeholder engagement that businesses can implement?
Thanks for that. I'll just answer the first question first. I do agree with Anita that it is going to take a little bit of time, and I guess just without wanting to temper people's enthusiasm too much, I think it's also important to point out that even where we do have countries who have signed on to the UN Convention, the OECD Convention, even in OECD member countries, and Australia I can speak to, enforcement is still very low. So in terms of corporate crime and pursuing cases against foreign bribery and corruption. in the case of Australia, for example, it takes on average 7 years for the federal police to investigate allegations of bribery of foreign officials or other transnational corrupt conduct. And that's because, you know, people don't always make it, they don't always wave the flag to say, oh, hi, I'm over here, I'm engaged in corrupt conduct, or I've been bribing a foreign official. You know, these are very difficult things to track. It requires immense collaboration across transnational enforcement agencies, and it's just really difficult to bring cases, either because of political will, either because of a lack of resources, or just because it's really hard to find the information to nail it. So, and perhaps human rights violations are more visible. Sometimes they are, sometimes they're not. But I just wanted to make that point that even with the law in place and with the best intentions, it can still be really difficult. In regards to the second question around good examples of gender inclusive participation, there's not enough that we can point to. Regrettably, there's some good work that's being certainly my own colleagues at TI Australia, who are in our accountable mining program, are progressing a body of work on the nexus between mining, corruption and gender. And that's where with our colleagues who are part of this program, we're really looking at what can help constitute good gender inclusive community consultation. So watch that space for some emerging work from us. I'd also acknowledge that you know, organisations like Oxfam have done good work on many years ago, even on looking at the gender impacts of the mining sector, for example, and how to do a gender impact assessment. You know, which goes back to your original opening point, Nick, around thinking about this ESG framework. Or how then do you include a gender impact assessment as part of a social and environmental impact assessment? Because of course developments and projects impact on men and women differently. And also I would add that the OECD working group on responsible business conduct has in fact developed some good guidance on meaningful stakeholder engagement and due diligence in sector-specific industries. The extractives one, I know, does include reference to gender, but the key point is we need to be really engaging with civil society organisations who are gender experts and women's organisations, and bringing them into the conversation to understand how to really put in place the best gender inclusive, meaningful community consultation, recognising that context matters, and what will work for women in one community is not necessarily going to work in another. You know, these are not homogeneous communities, and we need to factor that into our thinking as well.
Thank you very much. I'm now going to turn to Dr. Suri. I'm going to give you an opportunity to comment on the same question about mandatory human rights due diligence, but there's also a question that's been directly asked of you. In many countries, and maybe also in Thailand, there can be, to some extent, something of a culture of corruption in corporations and sometimes in government agencies. And sometimes, you know, some kind of forms of corruption are even seen as acceptable or morally fine, for example, in areas like education. So how should the government of Thailand deal with those cultural challenges?
Thank you, Nick. I was preparing for the response to the first question, which I think applies to the second one as well. My response to the development of a mandatory due diligence framework is that I agree with this approach. While we are having a debate on whether or not we should turn the whole guiding principles into, you know, mandatory framework, and we have seen the draft convention already being developed. I think that if we go thematically looking at due diligence in specific, And I think we will see a level of reception going on. And I already thinking of who will be the best actors, at least in Thailand. And we see that the SEC, for example, the regulators of the capital market that has already introduced requirement for making disclosure, how companies that are seeking to list in the stock exchange of Thailand have done in regards to the UNGP and the NAP. We can already ask cooperation, collaborate with the SEC to what extent they will, implement this kind of thematic mandatory due diligence. I think this will be well received. That's my response to the first question. The second question, let me put it this way. I want to give the example of the government pension fund. I already referred to this, the collaborative engagement that we signed with 32 fund managers last year has made an impact that we are committed, 32 of us, with 80% of AUM, that from now on, we are going to use ESG in our investment decision. It came at the right time, but it took many years before that decision or that initiative could bear fruit, because there had been an underlying flaw understanding that corrupt companies perform better than less corrupt companies. So when we want to push for ESG mainstream into investment decision, that had been very hard to do. But with the SDGs, with the UNGPs, with the signing of UNCAC, we can convince the fund managers themselves that this is the trend. We can't escape it. It is global trend. ESG is now coming. What we did with the GPF is that while we did not turn the whole fund, the GPF, into the whole ESG, we launched ESG focused fund of just say $100 million US. And we showed to the members, in this case, all civil servants, to tell them that last year, ESG focused fund performed much better than non-ESG focused fund. And now the GPF is moving forward to convert all our asset under management to be ESG compatible. Of course, I'm not saying that this will be easy to do, because we need to be nuanced as well. When we talk about how can we make sure that we conduct due diligence on corruption. Now you ask a more macro question, and I don't think I have intelligence enough to say that how we can get rid of this culture of corruption. But at least what from my own perspective, you at the beginning, Nick, you said using leverage. And I think that is a key to the success of whatever we are doing. GPF is using its leverage, money, the investment decision, ESG compatible, only ESG compatible companies we are going to buy stock from you. And I think that will provide a lesson, a good practice to all others. And as I said in the beginning, that we are having a no-gift policy. I only hope that it will create a ripple effect to a wider corporate culture that doesn't accept corruption as an acceptable practice. Thank you, Nick.
Thanks so much. Patience, in addition to giving you the chance to comment on the question about mandatory due diligence, I have a special one for you too. How does your corporation ensure that your codes of conduct are actually being adhered to by your supply chain beyond the contract? And what are the quality assurance measures that are effective in ensuring that?
Yeah, sure. So I would comment on mandatory due diligence first. I would find it a bit difficult for the legislation to impose mandatory due diligence. The reason is that there's so many small and medium businesses. I'm not sure how we can make them to implement a very comprehensive due diligence program while at the same time being able to be profitable and sustainable. Obviously, I'm not sure how you can measure the effectiveness of the due diligence program for, let's say, a sole proprietorship. So that's something I have some concern about. But I do think that it's very important for major companies to have a comprehensive compliance program. And then you can achieve that by requiring mandatory due diligence, or you can achieve it by, okay, if you really ended up paying a bribe, this is the fines that you need to pay, and then companies will deliver a program on their own. So in terms of supplier code of conduct, yeah, I do saw two of those questions. Very good question. I think there is a few ways we can achieve that in terms of how we want to increase the likelihood that a supplier will abide to the supplier code of conduct. First of all, yeah, that's why due diligence is so important, because I mean, you want to do business with someone who has good reputation, who has a very strong, stable financial record, and who has very good track record in being a good business partner. Because I mean, no matter how good the contractual protection is, I mean, if you are doing with someone who's insolvent or who's someone who are just bad, I mean, it's just, I mean, you can sue them, but they not even have the financial capacity to pay you. And also, most likely, in most jurisdictions, criminal liabilities cannot be contracted away. So first of all, due diligence is key. Secondly, I mean, obviously, I mean, for supplier code of conduct, the best practice would be to include it as part of the appendix of the supplier agreement, so that in the event that the supplier violates the provision of the code of conduct, I mean, you do have some sort of recourse, I mean, to terminate the contract or ask for indemnification. Second way. So the third way would be for certain extremely high risk vendors, you can consider also to provide them with trainings or compliance trainings on many aspects like anti-corruption, fraud, and money laundering, sanctions, human rights. And the final way is that you can always include in the contract and also exercise your rights as your audit rights. So you conduct third-party audit on the third party. So I mean, obviously that one is very costly. So you need to be very strategic about it in terms of what kind of third parties that you want to audit on. But I mean, if you have that audit cost, I mean, sometimes I mean, the third party will be a little bit concerned and potentially they will behave better because they know that whatever they do maybe potentially be audited. So in terms of how to measure it, yeah, I would think that like the audit would be a very good way to measure it. Another way that you can also consider doing is the annual vendor certification. The reason is, I mean, for companies when they do due diligence, I mean, they're not gonna, I mean, most companies will not do it every year. And some companies, they do it every year, but it will be like a full due diligence every 3 years, but an abbreviated due diligence every year. So in that time, you can also consider to have the vendor to sign any vendor certification just to disclose, okay, whether you have any new government officials that are actually a new owner of the company, whether you have get any fines from the government for any fraud or corruption conduct, so that you get up to date on their information. And also in the contract, you can also require them to notify you, like let's say within 15 days, I mean, if there is any major investigations on the vendor as well.
Thank you very much. And the last word is going to go to Professor Aisha. I'm afraid we have 1 minute left before we need to wrap up. So just on mandatory due diligence, if you have a quick comment.
Thank you, Nick. I suppose my comment would be, if you have good laws, that's one. But good laws does not mean anything if there's no effective enforcement, and if there's no effective monitoring, understanding, good interpretation of what due diligence is all about. I think this is just the beginning, of a new agenda. I think the fact that the law has come into force just last week is a good sign, but the work does not stop there. It might also involve consequential amendments of other law as well. When you talk about adequate procedures, for instance, you are linked with whistleblowing. We know that there are gaps in relation to our law on whistleblowing. So that's the first hurdle that we have to look into. Now, let's say you talk about due diligence in relation to companies relating to issuance of license, for instance, because we looked at complaints by indigenous people where these companies are actually going to the forest and so forth. This involves state and federal relationship. These are a different set of laws altogether. So I have to say that good laws is one. Enforcement and the political will is another, of course. The interpretation of the government officers for the first pillar, their understanding of the due diligence is one. How do they interpret that? And also, I think for members of the board to understand the interpretation, that's another. The last part, I suppose, is also a very big issue, is that the cooperation between the interagency. The MACC, the Malaysian Corruption Anti-Agency, does not and cannot work alone, because the data, the issues also lies with the other 28 ministries at the moment. So if we cannot find a metric solution as to how we work together, I think we will start with a very difficult solution. But what is happy, I think there's a lot of interest. There's a lot of interest in there, and I think that's a good sign for that. So I think that's
Thank you very much. I'd like, unfortunately, we can't all give you a round of applause. I know 300 people around the world would want to give you all a terrific round of applause. You've been a wonderful panel. Thank you very much indeed. And I'm going to finish with a last plug. I hope you enjoyed this webinar. Please come back and join the UNDP Fair Biz and ASEAN team tomorrow in our joint webinar with CIPW on after the pandemic, rebuilding global supply chains in ASEAN. So I just sent a link on the chat to everybody. It's going to be a great webinar tomorrow. So please join us again there. For the moment, thanks very much to all our fantastic panel, and look forward to working with you all again in the future. Bye-bye now, everybody.